Pakistan is represented there too. It is rising. It is under or below the rise in the average at a global level. But it's not the total number, but the percent of children in this last short period of 20 years. Until then, it was continuing to rise. Now this is, but even more important, is the fact that obesity may not be rising as much here, but mortality and decreased obesity, which is the red line, we're not on course to do that. You know, we're roughly at a 21% global rate of stunting. The target that was set by by WHO was 12% by 2030. So it's unlikely that we'll probably get there. But just so you see where the number, that green dot on the top of the green line is Pakistan. So it is far from what is even close to get to what we would want to get in 2030. And of course there's been many factors, anywhere from COVID and migration and conflicts at a global level that have impeded the possibilities of both adequate food supply, adequate distribution, and most importantly, education on feeding and nutrition. So we be here, you know, more than 6 to 10 times what it is in most other countries at the same income level, and overweight prevalence continues to be high. This includes adolescent children at about 10%. So those are the initial facts. So what should we be doing, and what can we do better? And I'm just going to focus on, in terms of the why, on two areas. One is immunity and how immunity is affected by what we are doing or not doing as it relates to nutrition. And the other one, probably more important from the point of view of what the ultimate possibilities and potential is for a whole society and a country, that relates to the cognitive development of children, who are the ones that are ultimately going to produce what any dependent on an adequate nutrition. And when we try to boil down what it is, or what are those factors, there are, and again, without going here just as an example of all the aspects of cellular immunity, humoral immunity, and barrier function, each one of which is affected by a relatively small amount of nutrients. So there are specific nutrients necessary for specific functions for all phases of immunologic response. But there's also a significant overlap in terms of what one nutrient does and what they do synergistically to improve the potential so a child fights infection, which is in a malnourished child the most common cause of death. However, the other important problem here, outside identifying those nutrients, and if you just prioritize the top 4, by far, vitamin A, vitamin D, vitamin B12, and zinc. That's it. We could make these better. We could decrease the range of morbidity and mortality from infection, you know, by many fold. Of course, easier said than done, but that's the goal, and it's just with relatively small amount of targets as it relates to nutrients. But the other important thing that also we have to keep in mind, and unfortunately the data is not great, the requirements by which we measure if a child is getting or not an adequate amount of A, D, B12, or zinc are what we call today our nutritional requirements. However, those nutritional requirements are defined for healthy children. They are for healthy children to stay healthy. So the truth is that our actual requirements for the majority of babies who are already stunted, already wasted, or having infection are probably even higher than what we, or how we measure deficiency today. So, outside immunity, of course, and I think when we talk about the long-term effects of undernutrition or inadequate nutrition, have much more to do with the potential for an individual to ultimately be productive in society. And that, of course, as Homo sapiens, cannot happen without an adequate development of the brain. And back again to the importance of these first 5 years of age, brain growth is pretty much done by school age. When you look at the weight of the brain, just total brain mass, 90% of the brain, the total mass, is done, organized, by 5 years of age. And by 10, 12, depending on the population, you will have reached adult size. So in the school years, brain will is when the brain achieves its maximum size. And gray matter, which is the cortical part of the thinking part of the brain, is already peaked by 7. And the important thing to realize from these curves, the brain volume on the top and gray matter on the bottom, is that after you reach those peaks during school age, they only go down. So brain size, gray matter, they only go down after that period of time in the life cycle. Many processes involved with this development of the brain. The first two, which are neurogenesis, formation of neurons, and synaptogenesis, that's the connection between neurons. The vast majority of that is done by 2. After 2, there's a dramatic drop in, you're not going to get any more neurons, and there's a dramatic drop in the number and the frequency of synapses, the connections between those neurons. And what starts happening in the preschool age and peaks during the school age of a child is 2 other big processes. One is myelination. That's the surrounding of myelin of the axon so that the neurons can communicate faster one with the other. And synaptic pruning. It's actually the other way around. The brain, to improve its efficiency, starts getting rid of unnecessary synapses, unnecessary connections. That makes the search engine work much more efficiently. And that happens in the cortex of the brain. So neurogenesis, synaptogenesis, 1 by 2, myelination and pruning to improve brain efficiency are peaking by the school years. And these 2 processes, myelination and pruning, are what increases the potential of the brain to ultimately achieve what we call cognitive executive functions. 3 main parts, go all the neurodevelopmental phases of the brain, but the sensory motor cortex, which coordinates and where children learn to write with one-handedness. The parietal cortex, which is associated to language. This is why learning languages is so much easier during school age and up to 12. After that, it becomes harder and harder and harder. And of course, the last part of the brain to develop between 5 and 10 years of age is the prefrontal cortex, developing in terms of efficiency, where the higher cognitive functions are focused. And again, it's myelination and pruning during that period that is necessary for the child to learn how to pay attention, for the child how to inhibit all the other things so that he can pay attention to one thing and not 10, how begin to calculate in their head, what we call working memory, cognitive flexibility to go from one idea to another idea, and ultimately goal setting. Okay, I want to do that, this is what I need to do. That all happens in the prefrontal cortex with myelination and pruning during school age. And this is what leads to what we ultimately call intelligence. Development of language, math, and executive functions, so that you can reason, you can make logical arguments, you can begin solving problems, you can begin planning, and have goals. And this is what we call fluid intelligence, which is what we measure with IQ tests and academic performance, etc., etc. Again, none of that happens without the development of brain during that period of time. And we know, of course, there are many determinants for neurodevelopment. One is genetic, very small differences, but there are differences. The others, of course, have to do with what the baby is exposed to. And the number thing that the baby is exposed to be able to develop a brain is what they eat. And there's word nutrition. And we don't have time to discuss all the environmental influences that can also affect neurodevelopment today. Just be sufficient to say that the baby's brain continues to be flexible and the adult young brain continues to be flexible, creating new connections, which is how the environment and stress can also affect brain function. But by far, malnutrition or nutrition is the most relevant factor in the formation of all the brain and the functions that we talked about just now. And when we look at the brain volume of children, and here's comparing adequately nourished versus undernourished kids with protein and energy malnutrition, total brain size, gray matter, white matter, and even spinal fluid are reduced in children who have protein energy malnutrition compared to normal children. Now, why in part does this happen? First, if you just look at energy. So our brain is about 2+ % of our total body weight, but it spends 20% of our energy. By 5 years of age, it's even higher. The brain of a 5-year-old child is spending 50% of the energy that it is receiving. And as you see those curves of the red is glucose uptake and oxygen consumption. Those peak by 5 years of age. That's when the brain is using the most amount of energy for its size, for its volume, than it will use in any other time in life. And this is again because you've got the formation of all these synapses and myelination and pruning that is happening, which requires energy. Second, of course, you need the building blocks, and protein is necessary for pretty much the formation of any kind of tissue, including the brain, including cell differentiation and proliferation and the synaptogenesis. Again, key components of this include not only protein, but certain essential amino acids, which are indispensable to have neurotransmitters. Brain cells cannot communicate without neurotransmitters, and you cannot have neurotransmitters without adequate essential amino acids, anywhere from tyrosine, phenylalanine, which are critical just for the basic dopaminergic norepinephrine and epinephrine responses, all the way to tryptophan, which facilitate the synthesis of serotonin and melatonin, which are absolutely critical for even the baby's behavior. So protein remains critical. And of course, aside from energy and protein, we do need micronutrients, which we started talking about similar for immunity. Neurogenesis, myelination, and neurotransmitter formation, all these processes that we talked about, all of them require specific nutrients. And if we look at those micronutrients, again, it's not a long list. And it's a list that overlaps because there's many that you need for each one of these different processes. And if you look at the one common denominator across the board for almost any brain process in growth and development is iron. And iron is key across the board, not to take away from the importance of folate, B12, zinc, and choline. And again, like we said for immunity, there's not that many. But we do need just one special word for iron because it is by far the most common micronutrient deficiency in the world. Everywhere, including well-developed and high-income countries. That remains the most critical deficiency, and as we just mentioned, it is the critical mineral nutrient, elemental nutrient. And we know not only iron deficiency, but iron deficiency anemia in particular are critical and will directly affect metabolism and neurotransmission in all the processes that we talked about just before, for a child to finally reach their potential during school age, after which that's going to begin decreasing. And in children, it is far well documented that pretty much of all those macronutrients that overlap, we mentioned just now, 6 to 24-month-old infants with iron deficiency anemia across the board will have lower cognitive, motor, social, and emotional development. One word about fat. 60% of the brain is fat. It's not protein. And of that, 20% are just the polyunsaturated fatty acids. Again, we don't have time to discuss the importance of these, but they're absolutely critical. One, for the formation of the lipid membrane that happens is part of any neuron, but also for the process of myelination, which is the fat that goes around the axons so that the axons can transmit information more efficiently and faster. So all these fatty acids, but particular polyunsaturated fatty acids and DHA are necessary for all the brain processes, but particular for myelination, which, as we said before, is what happens to develop executive functions during school age. Just like for immunity, the list is not that long. So more or less in priority: iron, zinc, folate, B12, A, and D. So the list of things we need to do to make things better is not that long. The challenge is, of course, how to make them better. But what we do know is that if we don't, these early life micronutrient deficiencies are going to affect the child for the rest of their life. And if we look at these in the local environment, we have today 1 out of every 2 children under 5 years of age in this region that are iron deficient. 50% are A deficients, and another more than 50% are vitamin D deficiencies. This not only affects brain growth, it affects brain function, and ultimately the potential for those children. When we talk about poor nutrition, and we absolutely must talk about poor nutrition, not only as undernutrition, underweight and wasted, but overnutrition, overweight, or obese. The other big problem we have today is what we call hidden hunger, which is harder to see. You don't see a fat baby or a thin baby. What you see is a baby who will not function well. And that hidden hunger is primarily due to micronutrient deficiencies. And while micronutrient deficiencies will affect somatic growth, body growth, including stunting, lead to stunting, the bigger effect is going to be on brain growth and cognitive development, which of course leads to poor academic performance and decreased productivity. Stunting is not bad because of stunting. It's not just how tall you're not. It matters because it is one of the most significant markers of specific micronutrient deficiencies that we just mentioned, and which are going to correlate with immune development and with brain growth. And when we look at when stunting happens in the life cycle, these are global numbers. This is the increment of stunting by age group. The numbers at the bottom, start at 6 months and end at 48 months. But the peak of increased rate of stunting in a population happens exactly during the complementary feeding period, from 6 months to 36 months. And that's when we see stunting growing. So basically, that's where the problem is. That means that's where we need to do something to decrease it. After that, after 4, the rate of increased stunting in the population starts decreasing. Not that you still have children who become stunted later in life, but by far, the vast majority of children with stunting this process, this lack of growth and development is going to happen in the first 36 months of age. So, in terms of the doing, the first is if a child can and should, and we're not discussing the first 2 years in particular, the first 6 months in particular, where a child should be exclusively breastfeeding. And the truth is that if a child does not exclusively breastfeed, they will enter the complementary feeding period already stunted, and will just make the numbers worse. After 6 months of age, which is the topic of today, a child should begin receiving solid foods. And really we should be guided by the developmental readiness of the child, anywhere from being able to control their neck and sitting up straight and being able not to keep thrusting their mouth. That's when a child is ready. The initiation of foods should be of any and all. There is no biologic rationale to say that a child should first get vegetables, or first get cereal, or first get meat, or first get dairy. There is no biologic rationale. A child should start getting, after 6 months, foods from any and all the food groups. The second important point is what if and when a child is offered any food, some they'll take, and some they'll take very easily, and some they will not take easily. Those that they do not take easily, they require continued exposure. A child is a blank slate. They are not going to tell you and really don't know what they can get used to expose the child to allergens the early during the weaning period. So there's no delay on food group. The child should get any at all. If you look at, well, as we said before, up to 6 months, exclusively human milk. After those 6 months, they should continue on human milk and begin the introduction of solid foods. And when we talk about that introduction, we said any food group, not only any, but all. And what has been agreed on, and this is, again, an experiential consensus more than anything else, is that to get a healthy diet, a child should get at least 5 of the 8 food groups, and these are the 8 food groups as per WHO. There's different ways of dividing them, but including, starting at the top, it's grains, vitamin A-rich fruits, other fruits and vegetables, legumes, meat, eggs, and dairy. Those are the 8. It's in every manual of WHO and UNICEF and so on. Those are the 8. To have any minimum chance of balance, the child should get 5 of the 8 every day. Without that, it is almost impossible to ever be close to reaching all nutrient requirements. Then they should be started on increasing frequency. For a 6-month-old, at least twice a day. At 9 months, 3 times a day. At 12 months, at least 4 times a day. There's a minimum frequency. And we'll talk a little bit about what and how we can increase the micronutrients in the food. What we have today here is that if you look at children, again, up to 2 years of age, when breast milk would still be recommended, 40% meet it. Meaning 60% of children today here do not meet breastfeeding as a minimum requirement. And when you look at meal frequency, 18% meet means that 82% do not meet minimum meal frequency. It's a bigger problem in urban areas than it is in rural areas than it is in urban areas. And lastly, when we talk about diversity, at least 5 types of food on a given day, 14%. So we are ways from meeting those minimum requirements, many of which are highly dependent on educating moms and physicians. So that's the what. And then what is the what not? I think we've been increasingly becoming more aware and strict about the recommendations that come from not adding any sugar to the food of a baby, especially in the first 12 months of age. In the first year, there is no need, no biological need, no physiologic need, and there certainly is a behavioral reason not to add sugar to the food that a child gets. And outside breastfeeding, water, and in a child who's not, formula and water, there is no reason to give any other kind of beverage, especially if it is a sugar beverage. And by sugar beverage, not just water with sugar or fruit, but even fruit juice. There is no real role for that. It is fruit, not juice, that kids should be getting. And again, we have, and these are WHO numbers, identified this list of what is called sentinel unhealthy foods. And it's pretty much anything that has a lot of sugar or some excess sodium. Candy, frozen treats, ice cream, cakes, chips, etc. Second thing, no reason to add salt. Just because we move up, they're moving up extremely slow, and it's going to take much longer than we expected, to reach the 70% target of exclusive breastfeeding globally that is likely to make a difference at a global level. When we look at the specific foods, at the green, the only food of solid food that children are getting enough of at a global level is grains. They're getting enough rice, wheat, corn, and starchy fruits like potatoes. That's it. When it comes to breast milk, meat, fruit, vegetables, legumes, eggs, and dairy, they're not. And when we look at the variety that we discussed, this is at a global level. Infants 6 to 12 months, that's the red line, the red bar, are the ones who are getting the least diverse diet. But even after 36 months of age, only 40% of children at a global level are getting a minimum of 5 different types of food. And we're not talking about the amounts. We're not talking about getting vegetables 5 servings for a 4-year-old, which should be what they get. We're talking about even 1 serving. And that's obviously a challenge. And this is not just a problem of low-income countries or developing countries, it's a problem across the board. For example, when we talk about adding iron to cereal, which is the minimum necessary in a high-income country, where we still have, in the US, we have 10% iron deficiency. We still have it. And it's easy to add iron because we have so many options of fortified cereals. Even there, at the highest, at 6 months in the US, 60% of children are getting it. After that, everything is lower. Most populations in any country, China, Mexico, US, Russia, are just examples here. We're not even close to getting the right amount of fortified iron in weaning foods. And vegetable consumption, something very similar. US is actually better, but even China is where meat consumption and cereal consumption is lower than in other emerging countries. It's still very low. More than 20, the bars never get to 90 or anything close, and most of them are below 50 of 6, 9, and 12 months receiving vegetables on a given day. So too little of some things, and unfortunately too much of others. The first is just calories, and when we look at energy consumption, so this is the daily supply of energy per capita, per person, at a global level. So the world, you see the black line. And what's happened just between 1965 and now, we've almost doubled daily supply of calories at a global level. So there is no surprise that we have an obesity epidemic. It's very clear. Now, supply doesn't mean exactly consumption. It means the amount of calories coming into the household, most of which are consumed, but not all. When you look at high-income countries, of course, that line is way up and much higher than the average. When you look at low-income countries, we still have, they're significantly lower, but we still have had an increase, in this case about 50% of total energy supply on a per capita basis. And of course, again, as we said before, most of this energy is coming from grains and starches, and it is not coming from meats and legumes and vegetables and fruits. On the other hand, if you look at children 6 to 23 months, and again, this is low-income countries, the majority of these children, anywhere from 30 to 50%, are getting either sugar added biscuit or confection, meaning candy or chocolate, sweet drinks, or added sugar, literally sugar added to the diet. So the chances today in a middle-income country, and the United States is an example of a high-income country, and that is while they're getting a lot of energy. Now, if you just want to let's spend 1 minute explaining this, and maybe the one takeaway that you see in terms of why we need to do something early. So this is the distribution of energy. This is the calories that you get from each food group from birth to 4 years of age. And the blue is breast milk or infant formula. The red is grains. The little 2 green blocks in the middle are fruit and vegetable, and the blue is meat, and the yellow is sugar and sweets. So that's what kids are getting. This particular data is from the United States. We've reproduced it pretty much everywhere. But what is interesting to see here is a couple of things. First of all the calories, the minimum amount of calories are coming from fruit and vegetables, which should be about 1/3 of the whole bar. That's number one. But number two, and probably more important, is that the amount of calories from each food group becomes fixed by 2. So a child who's 4 years old, of course, is getting meats that are different than when he was getting at 12 months, or is eating different types of cereals, or eating different vegetables maybe. But the percent of calories from each food group will not change all the way to adulthood. The data of a 4-year-old here is identical to the data of an adult. And where this curve becomes flat, where the change stops, is already at 2. So if we haven't fixed this by 2, it is going to be extremely hard to fix later. As we always say, it's easier to shape a behavior than to change a behavior. And that's, again, part of the pressure that we're under and that we should feel about doing what we need to do much earlier than most of the time that we talk about. And all this, unfortunately, has consequences, and they're not small. The first problem that we have, of course, is the numbers we talked about: a lot of wasting, stunting, overweight, obesity, and a lot of micronutrient deficiencies. Well, one of the challenges is that all these individual forms of malnutrition coexist. We can coexist in the same country, in the same community, in the same household, and in the same child. We can have an obese child with micronutrient deficiencies. We can have a wasted child with micronutrient deficiencies. And the challenge here is that it is becoming increasingly harder to tell. So there is no one problem, and there's no one problem that affects one part of the world. Obesity is a bigger problem in developing countries than it is in developed countries, even if it is because of an excess of energy. We already talked about where in the world we have greater amount of anemia, which is the bigger globe here, vitamin A deficiency and zinc deficiency, which go, as we said before, anywhere from 80 to 15%. Even the best countries still have iron deficiency. And the long-term consequences of this, outside productivity, have to do with what we call life expectancy, or DALYs, or the healthy life years lost. It's basically how many years you stop being healthy and die early. This global burden of disease, which has gone through several iterations of definitions, and most of them done with data from the World Bank and WHO. Look at all the factors that lead to loss of healthy life years, or disability-adjusted life years. When you look at all these factors, right, starting with high blood pressure and alcohol and pollution and fruits and diet, vegetables, all the red are diet-related. So today, 13 of the top 20 factors that lead to early death and early disability are due with what we just talked about. And all of these factors, high intake of sodium, low intake, so that by 2, we can define this, but it's going to be these within a population. And poor quality of diets, whether it's the recommended intake of different types of food, varies from poorest, which usually get less, to the wealthiest families in the same community, which will be getting more. And as you see here, huge, bigger differences have to do with meat, dairy, fruits, and vegetables. The last thing, in terms of trying to fill the gaps in foods, are going to help tremendously. We already talked about food diversity. The second is the balance. Half of the volume, half of the plate, half of the cup, or over the whole day, should be vegetables and fruits. And only the other half should be grains, proteins, and dairy. Aside from breastfeeding, at least up to 12 months. And we already talked about that in nowhere in this plate is there sugar or salt added. And the last thing, which we just wrap up in terms of foods, is what we call today fortification. And that's the mechanism by which we can help. We're not going to fix it, but we can help guarantee that we increase the micronutrient density of foods. And that is by consuming foods to which micronutrients have been specifically added. And this goes all micronutrients that we just talked about, natural list, but of course iron in particular. And there's plenty of evidence, and we don't have time to review all of it. This is this is the latest Cochrane meta-analysis done as it relates to the use of fortification in formulas and cereals for children under 2 years of age. Iron fortification of milk or cereals across the board will improve hemoglobin and reduce the risk of anemia. And children 2 to 10 years of age, multiple micronutrient addition to weaning foods, particularly milks and cereals, will also increase hemoglobin and markers for all the other micronutrients. And the effect in 5 to 15 is going to be there, but it's going to be significantly smaller, because obviously the marginal effects of health will decrease if we start later and later in life. This is the last systematic review of the U.S. U.S. Department of Agriculture, USDA, looking at the evidence for the specific weaning foods and iron status. Strong evidence showing that meats and iron-fortified cereal will maintain adequate iron status. And again, the benefits will decrease with children who already have sufficient iron stores. So the benefit is higher for the children with greater chance of deficiency. And when we talk about fortification of infant formulas, or what some people call young child formulas, again, especially in low-income countries, this can improve weight status in underweight children and improve the chances for decreasing risk of anemia, hemoglobin, and ferritin. So in this particular meta-analysis, which was again global studies, offer a safe, these fortification formulas offers a safe and acceptable source of complementary feeding as a short-term strategy to address nutritional deficits. And the last critical review, not a meta-analysis, but again looking at all the data in a descriptive way, fortified milk alongside a balanced diet are more easily ensures micronutrients from 12 to 36 months old. Now, this is not necessarily beneficially everywhere, and this is where we've gotten into some confusion, particularly with statements in North America and Europe, and says, well, there's really no clear need for fortification. Again, these are developed countries. However, there are other strategies to increase food acceptance, including micronutrient-rich products. The European statement now, the ESPGHAN statement for this is a little bit more balanced. There is no need for routine use of young child formulas in children, especially above 2 years of age, or 1 to 3, but they can be used as a strategy to increase iron, vitamin D, and polyunsaturated fatty acids, which are the bigger deficiencies in Europe as opposed to other countries. And of course, all agree that there are no real adverse effects to this when a product is both available and accessible. In other words, making sure that there is potential for the individual and the family to purchase products which are fortified. The last idea, and we're just going to spend 30 seconds on something that could and should take us much longer. It's not only about what we feed or when we feed, it's how. And unfortunately, we haven't really paid attention to this. It's clear that we work high on the safety of food, and we understand better the safety of food and how to store food, and for parents to prepare food, how to store food. We know, and it's a little more intuitive, that food can, of course, the texture can and should be, especially when the child beginning to eat, the texture should be in a way that don't require chewing until the child can chew, so the consistency and the amounts. We already talked about meal frequency. We already mentioned repeated exposure. A child is not born liking certain things. They have to be taught to learn certain things. And the last has to do with how, in terms of the response to the child, and here's where responsive feeding comes into play. Because it's hard to know when a child is typically full. And there's one construct, or one way to think about it, is what we call responsive feeding styles that are based on these behaviors. And that depends on how much control on the feeding moms should have, but how sensitive they should be to what the child wants or needs, right? And so, for example, we have the authoritarian mom, the one that is full control. She has that child eat this at this time, in this amount, is what she or what the dad wants, the child to eat, and you're going to finish this, and you're going to finish your plate, and you're not going to get anything else if you don't finish it. Then we've got the opposite, on the lower right, the permissive mom, where the child does whatever the child wants. And like this, doesn't get it. Likes this, that's all they get. So the child is in control. And of course we have, unfortunately, the neglectful mom that doesn't understand, that doesn't care much, and we have the the authoritative mom, who is the one that balances what and how much a child should get. When we look at rates of obesity, depending on the behavior of the parent, and we take authoritative as the base, the authoritarian mom has a much higher chance of her child being obese 4 times in this particular study than a mom who balances control and sensitivity. So we don't have time to discuss this, but if you summarize it like in one phrase, right? The parent decides what and when. And we just talked about what and when. But the child decides how much. Children know how much, and we should give them a chance. To conclude, we've made a lot of progress. However, we still have a triple burden. We have a lot of deficits and excesses, and the consequences, right, to this are both immune and cognitive, and those are the biggest ones that we need to face. And we can't express it more. Complementary feeding period is the most susceptible and the most sensitive to these deficits. So education at this time on a balanced diet and use of fortified foods is absolutely critical. This is going to establish the parents for the rest of their life. And we have a long ways to go, but parent education and providing undoing when, and how becomes critical for the future of our society. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. Saavedra. Okay, we have our worthy panel of experts, so I would like their comments on the topic. Dr. Lal, any comments, please?
First of all, that is Dr. M.Saavedra. It was very enlightening and informative talk. So give a big hand for Dr. Saavedra. Thank you very much. And also, you look at the galaxy of healthcare providers today with us. You see the seriousness of this. They are waiting for the lunch, but they are how serious they are. You see that this will improve the pace of improvement of a change in malnutrition in Pakistan. Hopefully, if you look to the 90s, when I entered in the pediatric, there was a 162 and above infants were dying per 1,000, and now it is around 50 per 1,000. So there is a change, but the problem is the pace is slow. So that is your lecture will help us to improve the pace as well. Now the house is open for the questions. Question answers. That's very important.
Yes, we'll take the questions, but any comments from your side? We'll take comments from other panel of experts as well.
Thank you. Dr. Jose, it was an excellent and nice lecture, and I really enjoyed it because being a